I was running late. Again, juggling a multi-million-dollar business and raising my 4-year-old son, Caleb, alone had turned time into my greatest enemy. I had a crucial board meeting in less than 30 minutes, and the last thing I needed was another delay. In my rush, I barely looked up when I pulled into the daycare parking lot. I grabbed Caleb's tiny hand, kissed his head, and hurriedly walked him through the doors. "Daddy's gotta go, bud. Be good, okay?" I ruffled his soft blonde hair as he clung to my leg. A woman at the front desk glanced up with a warm but surprised expression. I barely registered it. "Name?" she asked. "Caleb Reynolds," I said, adjusting my tie. She hesitated, glancing at a clipboard. "All right, of course. We'll take good care of him." "Great, thanks," I said, already turning toward the door. I should have noticed the strangeness in her voice. I should have noticed a lot of things. But I didn't. And that mistake would change everything. My meeting stretched longer than expected. By the time I finally pulled up to the daycare, it was past closing hours. I rushed inside, my heart hammering. The place looked different, warmer. Not as pristine as the daycare I usually sent Caleb to. My stomach twisted. Something was off. Then I saw him. Caleb, sitting cross-legged on a rug, giggling as an older woman, her hair streaked with gray, read a story to him. Around them, a few other children huddled close, mesmerized. Caleb's face lit up when he saw me, but he didn't immediately run to my arms like he always did. He looked happy, too happy. "Mr. Reynolds?" The woman rose to her feet, her eyes kind but assessing. "I was wondering when you'd realize your mistake." I blinked. "What?" She chuckled softly. "You dropped Caleb off at my daycare, but this isn't the one you usually send him to, is it?" My stomach sank. "No, it's not." She nodded. "That's what I thought." Her voice held no judgment, just quiet understanding. "Come, let's talk." I sat across from the woman, whose name I learned was Eleanor Foster. She was nothing like the polished, highly trained staff at Caleb's usual daycare. Her eyes had seen things. Her hands had worked hard. And yet, there was something in her presence that made me feel small. "Caleb had a great day," Eleanor started, watching me carefully. "He played, he laughed, and he even helped feed the smaller kids. You have a good boy." But what?" I leaned in, defensive. She sighed. "He was distant at first, a little unsure, as if he wasn't used to this kind of environment. When I asked him about his usual daycare, do you know what he said?" I shook my head, dreading her answer. He said, "My old school is big and clean, but the teachers don't laugh. They don't sit on the floor with us. They just tell us what to do." A lump formed in my throat. That's just how structured daycares operate." Eleanor held my gaze. "And do you think that's what a 4-year-old really needs?" I had no answer for her. Over the next few days, I found myself returning, watching as Caleb flourished in this daycare. He was different here, more open, more alive. And Eleanor, she wasn't just a daycare owner. She was a guide, a protector, a mother to all the children who walked through her doors. "You're a busy man, Mr. Reynolds," she said one evening, as I stood by the door watching Caleb help a little girl stack blocks. "You provide for your son, but are you present for him?" The question hit harder than I expected, because the truth was I wasn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. Eleanor's words echoed in my mind. "Are you present for him?" I had convinced myself that providing for Caleb meant giving him the best education, the best environment, and the best future money could buy. But was it really what he needed? The next morning, instead of rushing to drop Caleb off at his usual high-end daycare, I drove him back to Eleanor's place. "Daddy, we're going here again?" Caleb asked, his big brown eyes lighting up. I hesitated. "Do you want to?" "Yes." He grinned. "Miss Eleanor makes the best cookies." I sighed, rubbing my temples. Cookies. That was what made him happy. Not the state-of-the-art classrooms, the perfectly planned curriculum, or the overqualified teachers. I watched as Caleb ran inside, instantly melting into the environment like he belonged there. And maybe, just maybe, he did. Later that day, I sat in a board meeting distracted. "Mr. Reynolds, are you even listening?" one of my executives asked, snapping me out of my thoughts. I looked at the spreadsheets in front of me, numbers blurring. Profits were up, efficiency was an all-time high. But why did I feel like something was missing? I cleared my throat. Continue. But my mind was elsewhere, at a small, cozy daycare where my son was learning to be a kid again. By the third day, I had made up my mind. I wanted to know more about Eleanor. That evening, I waited until all the children had left. When Eleanor finally came out of the back room, wiping her hands on her apron, she gave me a curious glance. "You're still here?" she asked, amused. "I wanted to talk," I admitted. She motioned for me to sit. "Go ahead." I hesitated, then finally asked, "Why do you do this? This daycare, this work, it's exhausting, isn't it?" She gave me a small, knowing smile. "Because it matters. Because kids need more than just a place to be watched. They need love." Something in her voice made my chest tighten. "What about money?" I asked. "How do you even afford to run this place?" Her smile faded. "I don't do it for the money, Mr. Reynolds." I scoffed. "That's not a great business model." She laughed softly. "Not everything is about business." And for the first time in my life, I wondered if she was right. That weekend, I took Caleb out for ice cream, just the two of us. It had been a long time since we'd had a day like this. He chattered nonstop about Eleanor, the games they played, the songs they sang. "She listens to me, Daddy," he said between bites of his cone. "Like really listens." I swallowed hard. "And I don't." Caleb looked at me, innocent and honest. "You're always busy." It was a punch to the gut. For years, I had convinced myself I was doing my best. But maybe I'd just been doing what was easiest, throwing money at my son's upbringing instead of being present in it. Something had to change. That night, after Caleb had fallen asleep, I found myself pacing my penthouse living room, my hands restless, my mind unsettled. The city lights sprawled below, glittering like tiny, artificial stars, a reminder of the empire I had built. A world of deals, acquisitions, and numbers. A world I had once thought was enough. But it wasn't. I poured myself a drink, but it didn't settle the growing storm in my chest. Eleanor had done something no business partner, no rival, no board member had ever done before. She had made me question myself. I had convinced myself that throwing money at my son's education, hiring the best tutors, and enrolling him in the most prestigious schools was enough. That if I worked hard enough, built a powerful enough empire, I could make up for the absence of his mother. But Eleanor had held up a mirror to my life, and I didn't like what I saw. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the endless emails, messages, and notifications from my company. But for the first time, I didn't care. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. I walked into Caleb's room, sat on the floor beside his bed, and just watched him sleep. He looked so peaceful, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. His fingers twitched slightly, lost in dreams only a 4-year-old could understand. I reached out and brushed a stray curl from his forehead, my throat tightening. How many nights had I missed? How many moments had I let slip through my fingers, convinced that my absence was justified? Caleb stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering. He didn't wake, but his small hand reached out instinctively, searching. Without thinking, I took it, his fingers curling around mine. A simple gesture, but it shattered me. I had been running a business. Eleanor had been raising a child. And the worst part, she was doing a better job than me. The next morning, I made a decision. I cleared my entire schedule. No meetings, no calls, no board discussions. For the first time in years, I prioritized something other than my empire. I took Caleb to Eleanor's daycare myself, but instead of dropping him off and leaving, I stayed. The other kids ran to greet him, laughing, pulling him into their little games. Eleanor watched me with raised eyebrows as I lingered by the doorway. "You're not running off to some skyscraper today?" she asked, amused. "No," I admitted. "Not today." She smiled but didn't press. Instead, she handed me a small wooden chair, the kind made for toddlers, and gestured for me to sit. So I did. And for the first time, I saw the world through my son's eyes. It was messy. It was chaotic. It was loud. And it was beautiful. The children painted with their fingers, laughing as their hands turned into canvases of bright colors. They built towers out of blocks, only to giggle when they came crashing down. They played with toy animals, creating entire worlds in their imaginations. Eleanor sat among them, cross-legged on the floor, listening, encouraging, laughing. She wasn't just teaching them. She was being with them. And then I saw Caleb. He wasn't just playing. He was thriving. His cheeks were flushed with excitement, his laughter loud and uninhibited. He ran up to me, holding a misshapen clay figure in his small hands. "Look, Daddy," he beamed. I made this. I took the tiny sculpture, feeling its rough edges. What is it? It's us, he declared proudly. You and me. Something inside me cracked. I swallowed past the lump in my throat, pulling him into a hug. It's perfect, buddy. And I meant it. Later that afternoon, when most of the kids had been picked up, I stayed behind to talk to Eleanor. She wiped her hands on her apron, watching me with quiet patience. You look like a man who's had an epiphany, she said. I exhaled. I think I have. She folded her arms, waiting. I built an empire, I admitted, but I forgot to build a home. Eleanor's gaze softened. You're realizing it now. That's what matters. I let out a dry laugh. It feels too late. It's not. I studied her, this woman who had done for my son what I had failed to do. You're incredible, you know that, I said quietly. She smiled, shaking her head. I'm just a woman who loves kids. No, I said firmly. You're more than that. For the first time, Eleanor seemed taken aback. But she said nothing. Instead, she simply gestured toward Caleb, who was still playing, still laughing. Then prove it, she murmured. And I knew what she meant. That night, I tucked Caleb into bed myself. I read him a story, one of the ones Eleanor had introduced him to. His eyes drooped, and his tiny fingers clutched my shirt, as if afraid I would leave. I stayed. For the first time in years, I stayed until he was deep in sleep. And then, I made a vow. I wasn't just going to be Caleb's provider anymore. I was going to be his father. And that meant making some serious changes. The next morning, I called an emergency board meeting. My executives panicked, thinking something had gone wrong. But when I walked in, I wasn't the same man they had always known. I'm restructuring my priorities, I announced. Effective immediately. They blinked. What does that mean? One of them asked. It means, I said slowly, that I will no longer be available 24/7. I will delegate more. I will take time off. I will be with my son. Silence. But, sir, I held up a hand. No buts. Either you adjust, or I will find people who can. I had built this company. It wouldn't crumble without me. But Caleb, he needed me. And I wasn't going to fail him again. The backlash was immediate. My board members protested, my investors worried, and the media caught wind of my unexpected shift in priorities. Articles speculated whether I was stepping down, if there was an internal scandal, or if I was simply losing my edge. I didn't care. Every evening, instead of drowning in paperwork, I sat on the floor with Caleb, building Lego castles. I learned how he liked his sandwiches cut, triangles, not squares. I started reading bedtime stories instead of checking financial reports. And every morning, instead of rushing off to work, I walked Caleb into Eleanor's daycare and stayed for a few minutes. Just to watch. Just to remind myself of what I had almost lost. It wasn't easy. Balancing a billion-dollar empire with fatherhood wasn't something that happened overnight. There were days I felt like I was failing at both. But for the first time in my life, I was failing at something that mattered. One evening, as I helped Eleanor clean up after the kids had left, I made my move. You ever think about expanding? I asked casually, drying my hands. She gave me a wry look. Expanding. Yeah, I said, leaning against the counter. Opening another daycare. Maybe a few. You do something special here, Eleanor. More kids could benefit from it. She chuckled, shaking her head. And let me guess, you want to fund it? I smirked. Maybe. Her expression softened. You don't owe me anything, Mr. Reynolds. I do, though, I admitted. You changed my son's life. You changed my life. She met my gaze, something unreadable in her eyes. Then she smiled. We'll see. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. A few months later, I faced a new challenge. Caleb had outgrown the daycare. The day I told him he would be starting kindergarten, his face crumpled. But I want to stay with Miss Eleanor, he whined, clutching my shirt. I knelt beside him. I know, buddy, but you're growing up. You're ready for school. Tears welled in his eyes. I don't want to leave her. And in that moment, I realized, neither did I. That night, I visited Eleanor one last time. You'll still see him, I assured her. I'll still bring him by. She nodded, smiling. I know, but we both knew it wouldn't be the same. She had been more than just a caretaker. She had been the bridge that brought me back to my son. And I would never forget that. The day Caleb started school, I walked him in myself. He was nervous. So was I. As I knelt to hug him goodbye, he whispered, Will Miss Eleanor be okay? I smiled. She'll be fine, buddy. And she was. With my backing, she opened 3 more daycare centers. She kept her values, her warmth, her magic. More children found the love and care they needed. And as for me, I learned that being a father wasn't about wealth. It was about presence. One evening, long after Caleb had gone to bed, I sat in my office, looking at a framed picture on my desk. It was the clay sculpture he had made, the misshapen figures of him and me. Once, I had thought success was measured in profit margins and stock values. Now, I knew better. I picked up my phone and dialed Eleanor. When she answered, I simply said, "Thank you." She didn't ask why. She already knew. Years passed. Caleb grew. He still visited Eleanor. So did I. And one day, as I watched my now 10-year-old son help a younger child build a tower out of blocks, I realized something. The real legacy I was leaving behind wasn't my company. It was him. And for the first time in my life, I knew I had built something truly priceless. The world kept turning. Business continued. My empire thrived. But at the end of the day, my greatest accomplishment wasn't measured in wealth. It was in a 4-year-old boy who had once held my hand in his sleep, silently begging for my presence. And in the woman who had reminded me how to be a father. As I stood outside Eleanor's daycare, watching Caleb help the younger kids, I took a deep breath. Life wasn't about the things we owned. It was about the people we loved. And I had finally learned how to choose right.